In this video, we take a look at how to implement an application preference feature. This feature will allow a user to read and modify an application's settings and then store the settings to a config file, which can then be later loaded up when the application starts up. These settings can then be used to control the behavior, appearance, and the functionality of the application. So with that being said, let's go to Visual Studio and get to the coding. Here in Visual Studio, I have a WPF project set up. I'll be showing you how to implement an application's preference feature, which will simply allow us to store settings and retrieve these settings when an application starts up. Now here in the main window.xaml file, I have a simple UI defined, and it simply consists of a grid split in half. So it has two columns defined. The column on the left contains some labels, and the column on the right contains two combo boxes, two text boxes, as well as a button. So just as seen here in the XAML code, we have the definition for the labels, as well as the combo box, text box, and the button. All right, now let's go to the main window.cs file. The .NET framework provides a way we can store settings of an application. And these settings are simply stored in a plain text file. Now, the file can either be formatted in JSON or XML. So in this video, we're going to be looking at dealing with configuration files that are formatted in XML. Now, for us to do that, we need to make use of a class that the .NET framework provides. And this class is found in the Systems Configuration namespace. So I'll just go ahead and add this namespace. This namespace contains a class called the configuration class. We can use an instance of this class to manipulate a configuration file. So what I'm going to do here in the main window class is I'm going to create an instance or a reference to a configuration file using the configuration class. So I'll simply define configuration and I'll give it a name, app config. Now, for us to retrieve a configuration file associated to this application, I'm going to use the configuration manager class. So I'll simply say configuration manager, and this class has got a static method, and this method is the open exe configuration. So this simply means open this executable file's configuration. This method requires an argument, and in this argument we can specify which configuration file we want to retrieve. Now, there are times a computer might have multiple user accounts. So you might have an application installed on a computer, and each individual user account has got its own configuration file. So we can use this parameter here to indicate which configuration file we are trying to retrieve, on whether it's the configuration file for the current user or for all users. In this case, I'll simply set it to none. Now, settings inside the configuration file are organized into sections. Sections simply help us manage and group settings that are similar. Now, we can access these sections through this very configuration object returned. So what we can do here is I'll simply get the object app config, and here we notice that there's a property called sections. Now here we can retrieve a section that's defined on a configuration class by simply providing the name of that section. So let's say, for instance, I had a section which stores settings that relate to the UI. So maybe let's say UI settings. So this would retrieve an object that contains values that we can manipulate. And once we change these values, we can then save these values, and those changes will be made to the configuration file. Now here on this object, we have built-in sections that we can use. So we have a section called App Settings, and we also have another section called Connection Strings. Now, in this tutorial, we are going to create our own custom section that's going to hold information tailored to this application. So what we can do is we can add to these sections. We can simply call the add method, and this method takes in two arguments. One is the name of the section that we want to add, and the other argument is an object, which is the configurations section object. So this object will simply define the schema of our section, or the kind of properties our section is going to hold. Now in this case, I'm going to create a class, and this class is going to inherit from the configurations section class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the Solutions Explorer here, and to the project I'm going to add a class. I'm going to name this class UI Settings. Now that we have the class created, I'm going to inherit from the configurations section class. Now, within this class, I'm going to define some properties that are going to represent the settings that we're going to be storing in this UI settings section. The settings that I'm going to be storing are going to correspond to what is defined here in the UI. So that's the language, theme, font size, and currency setting. So the first setting will be a string type, and this will be the language setting. Now to declare that this property is a setting, we need to add an attribute, and this attribute is the configuration property attribute. Within this attribute, we can specify the name of the setting. So I'm going to provide a string, and in this case I'll simply provide language. And we can also specify a default value, and because this is of the type string, I'll set the default value to a string, and in this case I'm going to set it to English. Now here in the property, we also need to define a getter and a setter. So the getter method is used to retrieve this value. So for us to retrieve this value, we simply need to use this very class, which is our section. So I'll simply get this section. Then from this section, I'm going to get a property with the name language. So I'll simply get this text here and paste it here. So what this will simply do is it's going to look for a setting that's defined on the configuration file, and that setting should have the name language. Now, because it's a plain text file, it doesn't know what type of object is being returned. So here we need to cast this object returned. In this case, I'm going to cast it to a string. Now for the setter, we'll simply get this section, then we specify the setting we want to modify, in this case the language setting, and then we simply equate it to whatever value will be passed. So what I'm going to do is I'll copy this and I'll paste it 3 times. Now the second setting will be the theme setting. So I'll simply change this to theme, and the name of this setting will also be set to theme, and the default value will be set to light. So in the getter and setter method, I'll specify which setting to get, and that's the theme. I'll do the same for the currency setting. And this time, the default value will be simply a $sign. The property name will also be changed to currency. Then the getter and setter method will also be modified. The last setting is the font size. So I'll simply change this to font size. And the name of this setting will be font size as well. I'll modify the getter and setter. Now the font size will be of the type int. So in this case, I'm going to change this type to an integer. And here I'm now going to cast it to an integer. Now for the default value, I'll change this to an integer as well. In this case, I'm simply going to use 8. Alright, so here we have a section defined as a class. Now let's go back to the main window.cs file. Now the first time I access the configuration file, I would like to check if a section exists. So I'll simply use the if statement, and I'll get this object, which is the app config. Then on the sections, I'm going to check if a certain section exists. In this case, let me say UI settings. So I'll say UI settings. Now, the name of the section can be different from UI section. Whatever you would like to name it, that's okay. So what I'm going to check if this setting is no. So this line of code simply indicates that when the config file is being retrieved for the first time and it doesn't contain this section called UI settings, if this returns as no, we can actually create this section. So I'll simply use the same object, then I'll say sections, then I'll say add. Then here I can specify the name that I would like to use to call this section. And here I need to specify an object of the type of section I would like to store. In this case, it's the section class that I created. And this is the UI settings class. Now the name of this class and the name of this section can be different, that doesn't matter. But here we are just specifying that the sections that we are going to be storing should have the settings that are specified within this class. Now, this line of code is only going to run once. It's only going to run the first time we try to access this UI settings section. If it finds that it doesn't exist, it's assuming that the file is a new file or the configuration file is running for the first time. So it will simply add this section. Now here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to now retrieve this section. So how do I do that? So I'm going to create a variable. Then I'll simply say UI settings section. Now here I'm going to retrieve the settings that are stored in this section. So I'll simply equate this variable to, so I'll get the object, which is our configuration object. I'll say app config. Then I'll call a method called getSection. And in this method, all I need to do is to specify the name of the section I would like to get. Now this line of code here is going to return a section object, and the section object is going to have the values or the settings that we are storing. So once I have this section object, I would like to display the sections onto the UI here. To do that, I'll simply use data binding. So what I'm going to do is I'll say this window, then I'll set the data context object. So I'll simply set this data context property to whatever we retrieve from the config file. So once I have this information, I can now use data binding here. So let's go to the main window.xaml file. So here I have the controls that are going to display the information. So this text box here is going to display the font size. So what I'll simply do is I'll set the text property . So I'll create a binding and I'll simply bind it to a property which is the font size. Now WPF knows where to find this property, and it knows that because we specified that the data context is the UI settings section object that we retrieved. So I'll do the same for the other text box. This one will represent the currency. Now for these two combo boxes, we need to populate the drop down with some information. And to do that, let's go to the main window.cs file. And here I'm going to create an array of strings. So I'll simply say string array. And I'm going to say theme. I'll say themes. And I'll create a new array of a string type. So the first string will be dark, which will represent the dark theme. And the second string will be light, representing the light theme. So what I'll do is I'll copy this and paste. So I'll name this other array languages. And here I'll set this to English. And the second one will be set to Chinese. Alright, now that we have this list, what I'm going to do is I'm going to now populate these two combo boxes here with that information. Now here I gave these combo boxes some names. One is language combo box and the other is themes combo box. So here in the code behind, I'll set the items property, item source. So I'll set that to languages. And I'll do the same for the themes combo box. So I'll set this to themes. So, and that's it. Now what I'm going to do is I'll try to run the application. Alright, so we have the application up and running, and here we can see we have some values being displayed. So what happened is that this application ran for the first time and that configuration file did not exist. So what it did is it created that configuration file, and to that file it added a section, and that section is the UI settings section. Now here on the combo box we added some values, so it will simply show us these values, but it won't select these values for us. So we need to create a binding. So I'll simply close this. Now here in the combo box, we're going to create a binding on a property, and this is the selected item property. And this property is now going to pick from the list the setting that we have stored in the configuration file. So in this case, I'll set this to the language property. So I'll bind it to the language property. I'll simply copy this and paste. Now here, I'll set it to the theme property. So let's go ahead and try the application. All right, now here we can see the default values that we set. So we have English, light, 8, and the $sign. Now we can also commit the changes that we make here. Now remember, we are creating a data binding. So whatever we change here is being changed on the object that we retrieved. So once we make these changes, we can now save these changes. So to do that, I'll be creating an event handler here. And this is the clicked event handle. So I'll go to the code behind here, and we have an event handler added here. So what I'll do is I'll get this instance, which is the app config object. And once the changes are made, I'll simply save these changes. So I'll call the save method. So what's happening here is if the file is opened for the first time, we create a section, and whatever is stored in that section is defined based on the class that we defined earlier on. Now, if the UI settings section exists, we skip this step. Then the next step is to retrieve this section. Then from there, we take this section and bind it to the UI by setting this property. Now, because we are binding to the UI, we can simply make changes in the UI, and those changes will be made to this object. Now, once these changes are made, we can then call the save button. So what this is going to do is it's going to save these settings to the plain text file, which is our config file. So I'll go ahead and run the application. All right, so here we have the default values. So I'll change this to Chinese, and I'll change this value from 8 to 15. Then I'll go ahead and save. Now the question is, where does this config file exist? Well, it exists in the very same folder that this application is being executed from. So to check that, let's go to the Solutions Explorer, and here I'm going to show all files. And we see we have a folder called bin here. This is where our application executes from. So I'll expand this, and I'll expand the debug folder as well as this folder. Now notice we have a file that is named after our application, and it has an extension called config. So this is the very file that we are storing the settings to. Now, if we decide not to use this configuration class, this file will never exist. It will be simply omitted. Now in this case, let's go ahead and open it up. So now here we have this file opened up, and we can see that it contains a section here. And the name of this section is UI settings. And the type of section is based on the class that we defined here, which is in our namespace, and we have the name of the class here. And we can see the information that we stored is right here in this section, which is called the UI settings section. So we set the language to Chinese, and the font size was set to 15. Now for the other two properties, the reason we don't see them here is because we left them the way they were. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the application. And here we can see the values are being retrieved. So we have Chinese selected. And what I'm going to do is I'll set this to dark, and I'll change the currency to the letter K. What I'm going to do is I'll save. Then to see the changes, I'll simply click here on Visual Studio. So I'll close this, and here we see the changes appear. If we run the application again, we see we have the settings retrieved here. So we can use these settings to now manipulate the application's theme, language, etc. Now suppose we want to limit the input on this font size. For example, if we want to limit to 100 and below, anything above 100 should not be committed. So how can we do that? Well, we can simply go to the UI settings class. And this is where we define our section. So what we can do here is on the font property, we can add another attribute. And this attribute is called the integer validator attribute. So this attribute allows us to specify a minimum and a maximum value. So I'll simply do that. So I'll say max value, and I can set it to 100. I can also set a minimum value. Let's see, in this case, let's set it to 5. So I'll set the minimum to 5. Now, here in the main window, we need to change something on our binding. Now we understand that this text box is showing us the font size. So here in the binding, I'm going to add another attribute, and this is the validates on exceptions. So I'll simply set this attribute to true. Then from there, I'll go ahead and run the application. All right, so here we have the settings displayed. Now, if I try to go beyond 100, I'll simply add a 0. There we see a red line appearing. So it simply won't allow me to change this value. Even if I attempt to save, this value won't be committed to the settings file. So let's see, let's change the language to English and the theme to light. And let's leave this at 150 and try to save. If I close, I open the config file here. We can see we have English light, and this still remains at 15. So what we can now do is here, when starting up the application, we can retrieve these files, and then from here we can run some logic. So the kind of logic that we can run is changing the appearance and the behavior of the application. So simply put, the settings are stored in a plain text file with an extension called config. So guys, thanks for watching this video. Remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel if you find this content useful. I'll see you in the next one.